I came home to find strangers eating dinner at my table, using my dishes, sipping wine from my late husband's crystal glasses. My daughter sat among them, laughing. When she saw me in the doorway, her smile faltered, not from surprise, but from guilt. My name is Margaret Ann Hollister, though most people just call me Maggie. I'm 78 years old, a retired school teacher who spent 40 years teaching second graders how to spell, add, and tell the truth. I'm no saint, but I always thought honesty and love were the bricks that built a family. Turns out I was wrong. That night, standing in my own kitchen, I clutched the handle of a grocery bag in my hand so tightly the thin plastic cut into my palm. I had been gone only 4 days visiting my sister in Vermont, a rare treat for me, and I'd returned with fresh apples, jars of jam, and a small quilt she'd sewn for my granddaughter Sophie. But when I pushed open my door, it wasn't the warm welcome of family I found. It was betrayal served on porcelain plates. My daughter Ellen looked radiant at the head of the table. She wore my favorite silk scarf, the blue one Henry gave me for our 25th anniversary, and spoke animatedly to the well-dressed couple beside her. A man in a suit gestured with his fork, praising the renovation, my renovation. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the lemon polish I'd used before leaving. "Mom," Ellen said finally, voice brittle, "you're back early." I dropped the groceries on the floor. A jar shattered, red jam bleeding across the tiles. No one moved to help me. My grandson, Peter, shifted uncomfortably in his chair but said nothing. Sophie avoided my gaze entirely, her little hands wrapped around the stem of a wineglass far too big for her. She's only 15. "Who are these people?" I asked. My voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the weight of betrayal. "This is the realtor and her husband," Ellen replied. She smoothed the scarf at her neck, eyes sliding away. "We're selling the house." The words hollowed me out like a pumpkin at Halloween. Selling the house. My house. The one Henry and I had built brick by brick with our own sweat. The garden where he planted roses for me each spring. The oak tree where Ellen once carved her initials, declaring a childhood love. Gone. Erased? I stood there trembling, my world collapsing in slow motion. Ellen's guests cleared their throats, sensing the storm, but Ellen just pushed her plate aside and sighed. "It's for the best, Mom. You can't keep up with this place anymore. It's time." As though my usefulness had an expiration date, I turned and left before my tears betrayed me further. The groceries lay forgotten on the floor, glass crunching under my shoes. Upstairs, I closed the door to my room and pressed my back against it, listening to the muffled laughter drifting up from below. My family, my blood-breaking bread with strangers, plotting the sale of my life. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Henry's old armchair, tracing the worn fabric with my fingers, replaying Ellen's words until they burned like acid in my chest. It's time. Time for what? For me to disappear quietly? To let my daughter erase me the way she erased my name from the deed, as I would soon discover? But I'm getting ahead of myself. That night was only the beginning, the moment my life cracked open, and everything I believed about love, loyalty, and family shattered at my feet. And, my dear listener, if you stay with me, I will tell you how a 78-year-old grandmother, dismissed and discarded, found her strength again, how I plotted in silence, and how, in the end, I served justice colder than any winter night. But first, I must tell you what happened the morning after that wretched dinner. The morning I discovered Ellen had already stolen more than my dignity. She had stolen my home. I woke to the sound of clinking dishes downstairs, sunlight sliding across my bedroom floor. My body ached from sleeping upright in Henry's armchair, but worse than that was the heaviness in my chest. Betrayal sits in your bones like damp weather. It doesn't leave quickly. I washed my face, put on my cardigan, and went down with my head held high, determined not to let Ellen see me broken. The table was clear now, the wine glasses rinsed and drying in the rack. Ellen was at the counter, sorting papers into neat piles. "Oh, Mom, you're up," she said, too brightly. I was just getting some things in order. I saw the top page immediately, a property deed with my name crossed out. Beside it, bold as brass, was Ellen's name, written in the cold, precise script of a notary stamp. I froze. "What is this?" I asked. Her smile faltered, but she didn't hide it. She placed her hands on the counter, shoulders squared. "It's done, Mom. The house is under my name now. It was too much for you, and I took care of it. This is for your own good." I stepped forward and snatched up the paper. My hands trembled as I read it again and again, refusing to believe the black ink that stole everything Henry and I had built. How dare you? I whispered. You don't understand, she said, her voice rising. The taxes, the upkeep. You can't keep living here like this. I've got plans, Mom. Big plans. Selling this place will give us all a better future. You'll thank me someday. I laughed then, bitter and hollow. Plans for us? Or plans for yourself? Ellen's cheeks flushed. For the first time, I saw not my daughter, the little girl who once clutched my skirt when she was afraid of thunder, but a woman driven by greed. Her eyes hardened into something I didn't recognize. Don't make this harder than it has to be, she snapped. I'm already talking to buyers. It's happening whether you like it or not. I wanted to strike her, not with my hands, but with words sharp enough to cut through her arrogance. Yet nothing came. My tongue felt thick, my heart splintered. I set the deed back down carefully, as though it might burn through the counter, and I walked away. In the hallway, I stopped at the family photographs. Ellen at 6, gap-toothed and grinning in her first day of school dress. Ellen at 16, sulking with a bad haircut I tried to fix the night before prom. Ellen at 28, holding newborn Sophie in her arms, her face glowing with the kind of pride only a mother knows. And now, Ellen at 45, stealing her mother's home as though love meant nothing. I went out to the garden to think, to breathe air that wasn't poisoned by betrayal. The roses Henry had planted bowed under the weight of dew. I touched one lightly, remembering how he used to clip a bloom and set it by my bedside. For my Maggie, he'd always say. I had loved that man every day of our marriage, and I knew if he were alive, he would have thrown Ellen out on the street for what she'd done. But he wasn't alive. He'd been gone 12 years, and all that remained of him was this house, this garden, these memories. And now, even those were being sold out from under me. Later that week, I went to the bank. I wanted to see the truth with my own eyes. The clerk, a polite young man with sad eyes, confirmed it. Ellen had filed the paperwork months ago. Somehow she had convinced me to sign a routine document under the pretense of helping with taxes. I had trusted her, blind and foolish. My signature was there, black and undeniable. Is there anything I can do? I asked him, my voice barely more than a whisper. He shook his head. I'm afraid it's binding, Mrs. Hollister. I'm so sorry. Such a small word for such a monumental theft. When I walked out of that bank, the autumn wind caught at my coat, tugging me like an invisible hand, urging me forward. For the first time in my life, I felt truly homeless, even as I walked toward the house where I still technically lived. That night, Ellen hosted another dinner, this time with a developer. I stayed upstairs, listening to the laughter rise up through the vents, each giggle and clink of glass a hammer pounding another nail into the coffin of my trust. I sat in the dark, staring at Henry's empty chair across from me. I thought about my students, how I'd always told them that stealing was wrong, that honesty was the foundation of character. I thought about Ellen's little face, all those years ago when she'd stolen a lollipop from the corner store, how I had marched her back to return it, making her apologize to the shopkeeper. And now? My daughter had stolen my life, and there was no one to march her back, no one to make her say she was sorry, no one but me. That was the night the seed of revenge first rooted in my heart. But seeds take time to grow, and before anything sprouted inside me, I had to endure the long, bitter season of suffering. You see, betrayal doesn't just rob you once. It keeps on stealing your sleep, your appetite, your faith in the faces you once trusted. Every day after Ellen took my house felt like waking into a fresh bruise. At first, I tried to live as if nothing had changed. I cooked my porridge in the mornings, tended Henry's roses, even sat in my favorite chair with a book in the afternoons. But the air in my own home had shifted. Ellen walked around as though she were queen of a castle she hadn't built, taking calls with realtors in the kitchen, spreading glossy brochures across the dining room table. My once safe haven became a marketplace, and I its unwanted tenant. The worst part wasn't the paperwork or the plans. It was the way my own family, the grandchildren I had, rocked to sleep and fed cookies warm from the oven, began to treat me as though I were already gone. Peter, 17 now, and broad-shouldered, barely looked up from his phone when I passed him. Once, he had been my little shadow, begging me for stories about knights and dragons. Now he muttered, Mom says we'll have a pool at the new house. Isn't that cool, Grandma? As though I should clap my hands in delight at the thought of my memories being bulldozed. And Sophie, sweet Sophie, with her brown curls and quiet eyes, grew colder by the day. She rolled her eyes when I reminded her to mind her manners, scoffed when I asked her about school. One night I overheard her telling a friend on the phone, Grandma's losing it. She's so dramatic. Mom's just trying to help her. The words cut deeper than any knife. It wasn't only at home either. The gossip spread. At church, whispers followed me down the pews. Women I'd prayed beside for years tilted their heads with pity. "It must be hard, Maggie," one said, squeezing my hand as though I were already slipping away into senility. "But it's for the best. Ellen will take good care of things." I wanted to scream. Ellen wasn't taking care of things, she was taking them. But no one saw it that way. To them, she was a dutiful daughter, making the hard choices. To me, she was a thief in pearls. Loneliness settled over me like an unwelcome blanket. I stopped calling friends, ashamed to admit what had happened. I stopped visiting the quilting group at the community center. The thought of explaining why Ellen was hosting open houses in my living room was unbearable. Even the garden, once my place of solace, felt tainted. I could no longer sit among the roses without hearing the echo of Ellen's voice promising buyers plenty of space for a pool. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake listening to the murmur of Ellen's voice on the phone, planning renovations, talking money. Sometimes she laughed, a sharp, greedy laugh I'd never heard before, and it chilled me to my bones. Henry's absence pressed heavy then. I longed for his steady hand, his deep voice saying, "Don't you worry, Maggie. We'll sort this out." But all I had was silence. One evening, I tried to reach Sophie. I knocked on her door softly and stepped inside. She was sprawled on her bed, scrolling her phone. "Sophie," I began gently. "Do you remember when you were little and you used to sneak into my bed during thunderstorms? You'd say, 'Grandma, the thunder's too loud,' and I'd hold you until you fell asleep." She didn't look up. "Yeah, I guess." "Well, I want you to know, I'd still do that for you," I said. "No matter how old you get, I'll always be here for you." Finally, she turned to me, but her eyes weren't soft like I remembered. They were guarded, impatient. "Grandma, can you not? Mom says you're making everything harder. Just stop." Her words slammed into me like a door shutting. I nodded, backing out of her room with a smile I forced to hide the crack in my heart. But when I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, my body shaking as silent tears rolled down my cheeks. The truth was plain. I was becoming a ghost in my own family. The following Sunday, I didn't go to church. I sat alone at the kitchen table while Ellen left with the children, dressed neatly, their laughter trailing out the door. On the table before me was Henry's Bible, the leather worn soft from his hands. I opened it, searching for comfort, but the words swam through my tears. I whispered aloud, "Lord, why have you abandoned me to the people I love most?" And then the thought came, unbidden but sharp. Perhaps he hasn't abandoned you. Perhaps he's waiting for you to stand up. It was a terrifying thought. For months I had sunk into sorrow, letting Ellen sweep me aside. But sorrow alone doesn't change the world. It only drowns you. Still, at that time, I wasn't ready to rise. Not yet. The seed of revenge was there, buried deep. But seeds don't sprout overnight. They need darkness, pressure, and pain before they break open. So I sat in the quiet, suffering, letting the pain shape me, letting it harden into something sharper than grief. One evening, as I looked out the window, I saw Ellen in the yard pointing to the garden with a man in a pressed suit. He made notes on a clipboard while she gestured toward Henry's roses. I watched as she mimed pulling them out, her hands moving like claws tearing through the earth. That sight, my dear listener, was the final stone on my chest. They weren't just taking my house. They were erasing Henry, erasing me. And that was when I knew, if I wanted to survive, if I wanted to keep even a shred of dignity, I could no longer simply endure. I had to begin to plan. Grief is paralyzing, but planning? Planning gives you back your breath. I had been wallowing in sorrow for weeks, shuffling through my days like a widow twice over. Ellen thought she had broken me, that I was too old and fragile to resist. But I was not broken, only bent. And when you bend an old branch, my dear listener, sometimes it snaps back with more force than you expect. I began slowly, carefully. First, I stopped crying in front of them. Ellen thrived on my weakness. She mistook my tears for surrender. So I dried them. I smiled when she prattled on about renovations, nodded when she spoke of buyers, and bit my tongue when the children ignored me. I became quiet, invisible even, and in my silence I watched. I watched how Ellen stacked her paperwork on the dining table, careless of what she left in plain sight. I watched how she poured her second glass of wine in the evenings, her laughter growing louder with every sip. I noticed how Peter bragged about his new car fund and Sophie flaunted new clothes that Ellen could never have afforded on her salary alone. My daughter's greed was feeding them all like some poisoned banquet. At night, When the house finally settled into silence, I opened Henry's old desk drawer and pulled out a notebook. I began to write dates, times, details of conversations I overheard. I wrote down every shady remark Ellen made to developers, every whispered promise to buyers, every careless boast about my property. Words on paper have power, and I meant to gather enough of them to wield like a weapon. But I knew I couldn't fight her alone. Old women are many things: patient, watchful, underestimated. But we need allies. Mine came from an unexpected place. One morning, I walked to the corner store for milk. Behind the counter was Gloria, a stout woman with a sharp tongue who had been my neighbor for 40 years. "Maggie," she said, narrowing her eyes, "what's this I hear about your Ellen selling the place?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, but something in Gloria's gaze, half concern, half fury on my behalf, opened a door inside me. I told her everything. Not all at once, but in a trickle that became a flood. When I finished, she slammed her hand on the counter. "That girl ought to be ashamed," she spat. "You can't let her get away with this." I smiled faintly. "I don't intend to." From then on, Gloria became my confidant. She had a niece who worked at the courthouse and another who worked at the county records office. Between the two of them, she said, "We'll get our hands on whatever we need." And so, my quiet plotting began to grow roots. I also reached out to an old student of mine, Thomas Green. He had been one of my brightest pupils, now a lawyer with his own practice downtown. I wrote him a letter. Not an email, not a phone call, but a handwritten letter, the kind that carries weight. I told him only the bare bones at first, that I suspected foul play in the transfer of my house, that I needed advice. Within days, he replied, inviting me to meet him. The meeting had to be secret. Ellen would never suspect her 78-year-old mother of sneaking around, but I didn't want to test her. So one Thursday morning, I told her I was going to the library. Instead, I took the bus downtown and walked 3 blocks to Thomas's office. He greeted me with the same warm smile I remembered from the boy who used to bring me dandelions for my desk. But when I told him the full story, that smile faded into a tight line. "Hollister," he said, his voice low but firm, "if what you're saying is true, your daughter could be guilty of fraud, especially if she misled you into signing something under false pretenses." I nodded. "That's exactly what she did." "Then we'll need proof," he said. "Documents, witnesses, anything that shows she tricked you or that she's using the property for personal gain at your expense. Do you think you can gather that?" I sat up straighter. "I was a teacher for 40 years, Thomas. Gathering evidence is second nature to me." He chuckled softly, then grew serious again. "But be careful. Don't let her know you're onto her. People get desperate when they sense the ground shifting under them." I left his office with my heart pounding, not from fear, but from purpose. For the first time since Ellen's betrayal, I felt alive again. That night, when Ellen poured her wine and boasted on the phone about an all-cash offer, I smiled to myself. Every careless word, every greedy slip, I was catching like rain in a bucket. And when the time was right, I would tip that bucket over her head. My dear listener, there is a particular kind of strength that comes with age. Not the strength of muscle, but of patience. I had nothing but time, and I intended to use every second of it to make Ellen regret the day she ever thought her mother weak. The suffering had burned away the softness in me. What remained was something sharper, something steel. And with it, I began to weave the net that would one day catch her. Net making is a slow, patient business. You don't rush the knots. You make them small and strong, and you test them one by one. My first knots were simple: documents, dates, names. I filled pages in Henry's old notebook with the who, what, when, and where. But paper is only useful when someone can read it and believe it. So I gathered People Mech's little allies who had no love for Ellen's polished smiles. Gloria's niece, Maria, proved quicker than I expected. She worked nights at the county records office, a paper shuffler with access to things most folks never even dream of checking. I paid for her coffee for a month and told her stories, harmless things, nothing that would put her in trouble until she warmed to me. Then, one rain-slick morning, she slid an envelope across my kitchen table without knocking. Inside were copies of every document Ellen had filed in the last 18 months. The deed transfer, a stack of tax assistance forms, and a heavily redacted contract with a development company. The deed copy had a notary stamp that looked oddly skewed, the signature not quite matching the other samples. Maria shrugged like she didn't mean much by it, but I saw the hint of a door opening. Thomas, my lawyer and former pupil, was the next bow I tied. He read the records in my kitchen. his brow creasing deeper with each page. "This isn't just a daughter being practical, Maggie," he said, folding his hands. "There are inconsistencies here. You were led to sign a financial consent that was actually a conveyance form secured behind the language of taxes. If we can show you didn't understand what you signed, or that you were misled, we can have the transfer voided." He set to work in a way that made me proud and frightened all at once. He subpoenaed the notary's log. He put a call into the title company. He requested emails from the developer. Legal channels move with the detachment of a glacier. The glaciers, I reminded myself, reach the sea in time. Meanwhile, I would be the pebble that started the trickle. For the trickle, I turned domestic. I adjusted my routine to be in places Ellen did not expect. I started to sit more in the parlor when she took calls. I began to walk the dog, a neighbor's golden retriever I'd offered to pet sit, past the kitchen window at certain hours. You'd be surprised how careless a person becomes when they believe no one is watching. Ellen's phone calls grew more vocal as she boasted about closing the deal and a little side profit to someone I could not yet place. I couldn't intercept her messages, but I could listen. Old houses carry voices into themselves, and I learned to stand where the hallway made a natural microphone. A few choice phrases: cash wired, edge of town, no need to wait for signatures. I wrote down like jewels. Thomas told me to be careful about repeating exact words in court, but the pattern mattered. The hardest ally to win was Sophie. For weeks she had avoided me, her silence a small, relentless torment. I began leaving little things in places she would find them. The scarf she loved, the box of cookies she used to burn when she was 8. I wrote her a long note, no lecturing, only memories. Thunderstorms and secret cookies, a scraped knee, and a kiss that fixed it. 2 nights later, she knocked a careful small thing on my door like she hadn't wanted the house to hear. She sat on the foot of my bed, and we talked like strangers from the same old town. Slow and halting at first. "I didn't know," she said finally, voice small. "Mom says you signed willingly. She says it's for the family." "Does your mother tell you everything?" I asked gently. She swallowed. "No." Then, in a whisper, "Mom doesn't want me to know about the cash she's been bringing in. She said not to worry about where it came from." Her eyes dropped to her lap. I thought she meant loans, but the rest of the sentence came out as a sigh. Sophie had seen a sliver of the truth. It was small and tremulous, but a sliver can be carved into a wedge. She agreed to be careful, to be present when Ellen was alone, to feed me casual information. Children today may be loud, but they forget less than they let on. I also found an unlikely friend in Mr. Alvarez, my next-door neighbor. He was a retiree from the water company who knew how pipes ran under the neighborhood and how contractors tried to game permits. Over coffee, I learned that the new developer had no legitimate history with the city, no permits on record, only a P.O. box and an old cell number. Mr. Alvarez offered to check records, to sniff out the kind of paper trail only a man used to following leaks could follow. He showed up one day with a list and the sort of low chuckle people make when they smell someone's bluff. As my small coalition gathered proof, I set a few traps to unmask Ellen's arrogance. I invited her to a family meeting. Under the pretense of discussing Sunday plans, Thomas sat discreetly in the parlor under the pretense of needing to translate an old legal phrase for me. Gloria called at just the right minute with a disturbance at the door so Ellen would step away to answer, leaving her laptop open. It was bold and a touch theatrical, but desperation tends to make artists of the wronged. When Ellen returned, she laughed and leaned against the dining table, careless in the way the guilty become. "We've got the buyer on hold," she told me, not looking up. "All cash moving in 30 days. She flipped her hand as though she were flicking away a fly. I walked by the table, fingers brushing her laptop, and pretended to be distracted by something in the next room. Thomas was quieter than I expected, a study in patience, and when Ellen's email notifications blinked on the screen, he took a breath I could feel. Later, in the kitchen alone, Ellen spoke into the phone as though announcing to a confederate. "She's not suspicious at all," she crowed. "She's 78 and sweet as pie. The deed's done. We'll get them to move out on good terms. Cash in 2 weeks." I had the words written down before the sentence finished. They were small, ordinary things, but they were enough. I taped the paper into my notebook that night like a victory. Proof, no matter how small, stitches doubt into arrogance. I kept the page under Henry's dictionary where I could reach it easily and where Ellen would never think to look. There were risks. There were nights when I lay awake and imagined Ellen discovering our work and lashing out. But anger, in my experience, is loud and obvious. It gives you chances to see the true face of a foe. Ellen still believed I would crumble. That belief was my greatest gift, so I continued my quiet gatherings. Records, witnesses, the careful placement of questions that made people reveal more than they intended. I learned to be patient in a new way, the kind that comes not from time alone but from focus. The net took shape, small loops of paper and speech, and sworn statements woven together until they could hold a person up. By the time winter clouds gathered on the horizon, my little conspiracy had a backbone. We were not yet ready to strike, but we were already far from helpless. I had allies, I had proof, and, most dangerous of all for my Owen Dane, I had patience. So, we struck like winter, slow at first, then hard and clean. The morning we decided to move was ordinary as any other, a pale sky, Henry's kettle hissing on the stove. But the things we set in motion that day made it anything but ordinary. Thomas arrived with a stack of legal papers folded like a secret. Gloria parked her car 2 houses down and came with Maria tucked beside her, eyes bright with the excitement of a conspirator who has finally been asked to do something brave. Mr. Alvarez walked over with a folder of municipal printouts clutched under his arm like a weapon. Sophie, small and determined, had the look of someone who had chosen a side. "You sure you want to do it this way?" Maria whispered to me as we stood in the parlor. Her voice trembled just enough that I knew she felt the weight of what we were about to do. She had risked a lot already, her night shift job, the favors in county, yet she'd come anyway. That made her braver than a dozen men. I smoothed my cardigan and patted Henry's old armchair as if blessing it. "We do it the way that's honest." I kept my voice steady because honesty has a way of making even the most frightened person feel upright. We let the truth do the heavy lifting. Thomas's plan was precise. He filed an injunction that very morning to freeze any further sale activity and to require the title company to produce the original deed and the notary's journal. He served Ellen with papers that would make any reasonable person tremble. Allegations of fraud, misrepresentation, and the request for a temporary injunction that would halt the sale while the court examined the evidence. The papers were delivered by a process server who took special delight in being punctual. Ellen opened the door, wine glass still warm in her hand, and when the man handed her the documents, she looked at them as if they were a joke. She laughed, an audible, too loud sound. "What is this?" she scoffed. "What is she trying to do? Scare me?" But the man didn't take the laugh as an insult. He simply folded his arms and said, "I'm just the messenger, ma'am." Then he left. Silence followed, like the pause after a dropped plate. You should have seen the color drain from her face when she went inside and read the words for herself. For the first time since that night when she first crossed my name out, she looked afraid. Not for the house, but for the secret she had tucked into the edges of paper and phone calls. Fear suits guilt badly. It makes your smile crack and your hands fumble. We let the legal system do its work, but the court alone would not unmake the quiet cruelty of the past months. That is where the rest of our planned poetry in motion, if I allow myself to be vain, came into play. We needed the court to see a pattern, but we also needed the neighbors, the church ladies, and the developer to be shown as what they were. People willing to build a future on the bones of someone else's life. The truth needs an audience. Thomas arranged for a meeting at the community center under the guise of discussing neighborhood improvements. Nearly everyone came. Those who had once given Ellen nods in the church foyer, the parents of her children's friends, and more than a few who had been quietly curious about the open houses. I sat near the back, hands folded in my lap, and watched Ellen stride to the front like a woman claiming a stage. She smiled, practiced and bright. The developer, slick, smooth, with an accent that could charm a ledger, stood beside her, arms folded. Thomas did not approach them like an adversary. He asked questions gently at first. "Mrs. Hollister, when did you first sign these forms? Did anyone explain to you what these papers meant?" He let the questions hang like traps in the air. Then, one by one, witnesses tense, unsure, then increasingly certain told their stories. Maria described how she had seen the notary log show an entry at an odd hour and how a signature there didn't match previous ones. Alvarez explained the absence of permits where the developer claimed they existed. Sophie, with a voice that shook but did not break, told the room about the cash envelopes and late-night conversations she'd overheard. Ellen tried to interrupt, to wave it all away, but each interruption only tugged a thread. People began to murmur. Faces shifted. The developer, who had stood so composed, flushed when someone asked for his company's incorporation papers, He shifted his feet and muttered something about an accountant. I watched the audience, a congregation I had known all my life, tilt from curiosity to discomfort. That tilt is precious. It makes the comfortable uneasy. Then, the small perfect thing happened. The notary, old Mr. Kent, who had notarized the deed, arrived late to the meeting. He shuffled in, cane tapping, red-faced and apologetic. He did not expect to be called upon, but Thomas had quietly arranged for him to be present, and his presence was the strike that made things fall apart. When asked to verify the signature, he squinted at the paper and admitted, slowly and with a sorrow that sounded like a confession, that his signature had been applied in haste the day the deed was recorded. He fumbled through his log and found that his journal entry had been filled out in a hand not entirely like his own. He could not say for certain, he stammered, but he knew enough to ask for an investigation. It's an odd thing to watch a person who has been unquestioned in their polite life get uncomfortable under scrutiny. Ellen's mask slid then, just a fraction at first, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, then wider. She began to cry, but the cry was performative, full of melodrama. My mother is making up lies, she wailed. This is my family's future. She looked toward Sophie as if to find an ally. Sophie met her gaze with something that could have been pity. That glance alone felt like a little victory. The room had shifted. The developer excused himself on an urgent call and left in a flurry. After that day, things moved faster. The title company, now wary, suspended any transfer of funds until the court issued a decision. The developer found himself on the defensive when the county's permit office called to confirm his claims. I received letters, not the soft kind Ellen had used to lull me, but the formal, bristling kind lawyers write. Ellen, who once spoke like a woman in control, began to talk in fragments at home. She whispered to Peter. She snapped at Sophie. Her laughter died down. But the sweetest part of this slow unmaking was not the legal filings or the developer's irritation. It was the way people's perceptions changed. The neighbors who had once praised her economy of taste now looked at her as someone who had perhaps walked too quickly over her own family's history. The church ladies, who had once called her dutiful, now began to ask questions in soft, insistent ways. The very community that had allowed something like this to slide began to pull back, and when communities pull back, the social currency dries up. People are less willing to buy from a face they suspect hides a lie. I do not relish cruelty for its own sake. Revenge, as I have learned, is sweetest when it is not spite, but correction. I wanted the scales to tip, not to crush Ellen into ruin. I wanted justice. I wanted my home and my dignity recognized again. I wanted my grandchildren to learn that loyalty matters more than profit. By the time the injunction was extended and the judge issued a call for a formal hearing, Ellen's bravado had turned brittle, like dried paint cracking on an old chair. She began to pace at night, muttering plans that involved selling to a private buyer or moving quickly before the papers freeze everything. She tried to buy favors, to apologize in ways that were all calculation, but the net we'd woven paper, testimony, and neighbors' small recollections held firm. And the most human part of my revenge, the part that warmed me in quiet moments, was watching Sophie sit with me willingly at the kitchen table, her phone silenced, her homework spread out, her head leaning against my shoulder like a child again. Little things returned, cookies shared as we'd always done, stories traded in the twilight. Those moments told me that, even if the house were slow to return, something else was already mending. We had started with patience. Now, as the first cuts of our plan drew blood from the lie Ellen had spun, patience became vindication. The true work was only beginning. But the skies had shifted, and when the skies shift, even old trees can stand straighter. The true work began in earnest with the hearing. Courtrooms are not made for women like me. Hard pews, stiff air, the cold weight of silence pressing down while men in ties shuffle papers and mutter. But I held my head high, wearing the same brooch Henry had given me on our 50th anniversary. It reminded me that love once lived in this house, and that truth had a right to defend it. Ellen arrived in her red blazer, the one she wore when she wanted to seem important. She had Peter at her side, gray at the temples now, his shoulders hunched with the unease of a man dragged where he did not want to be. Sophie trailed behind, eyes downcast, her hands shoved into her pockets. When Ellen glanced back to check on her, Sophie didn't look up. That was the first crack. Thomas spoke first. Calm, deliberate. His voice carried the weight of someone who believes in every word he says. He laid out the chain of fraud signatures that bore no witness, permit files that contradicted Ellen's claims, payments routed through hands that couldn't withstand daylight. Every time he presented a fact, he turned to the judge, not the crowd, as if truth needed no audience. I watched Ellen squirm, her lips twitching, her fingers tugging at her blazer sleeve. Then came the witnesses. Maria, trembling but unshaken, recounted the oddities of the notary log. Mr. Alvarez, stern and proud, explained how the developer had tried to push through zoning without clearance. Even Gloria, who'd only been on the periphery, described overhearing Ellen boasting at a church luncheon about freeing herself from her mother's anchor. The words hit the room like stones. Ellen tried to defend herself. She called me confused, forgetful, claimed I had invented grievances out of loneliness. But the more she spoke, the thinner her voice became. The judge leaned forward, brows raised, as though even he could hear the desperation woven between her sentences. And then came the moment I had prayed for. Sophie was called. She rose slow but steady and walked to the stand. I saw Ellen's eyes widen, a hand reaching toward her daughter as if to pull her back. But Sophie kept walking. She sat down, straightened her shoulders, and in a voice that was young but unflinchingly clear, she told the truth. She told them about the envelopes of cash, about her mother whispering that Grandma wouldn't notice what was gone, about the nights she had lain awake listening to Ellen and the developer plan to sell the house before I could stop it. And when the lawyer asked her why she had stayed silent for so long, she looked down, then up again, eyes wet but determined, because she's my mom. And I wanted to believe her. But she was wrong, and I don't want to be like that. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of shifting loyalties, of people realizing that Ellen's story had collapsed from within. She had raised her own witness against herself. Ellen's face turned pale, her lips trembling as she hissed something under her breath that Sophie ignored. The judge ordered a halt to the sale and demanded a forensic examination of the deed. He warned Ellen of serious repercussions should fraud be confirmed. For the first time, I saw her shrink, not into tears, not into anger, but into something smaller, a woman cornered by her own greed. But revenge, my dears, is not only about legal victories. It is about restoring what was taken from you in spirit. That evening, after court adjourned, the neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid me came to my door. They brought pies, kind words, apologies cloaked in nervous laughter. One even offered to repaint my fence. The community that Ellen had courted so eagerly now turned its warmth back to me, leaving her out in the cold. And sweet Sophie returned that night with her school bag and a soft knock on my door. She didn't ask permission to come in. She simply did, curling onto the couch with a blanket and whispering, "Can I stay here for a while?" I stroked her hair and said yes, and in that yes was all the triumph I ever needed. Ellen, meanwhile, found herself alone. The developers stopped answering her calls. The church lady stopped saving her a seat. Peter, weary and ashamed, began sleeping at his brother's house. And when the newspapers ran a small piece about suspected real estate fraud under investigation, her name appeared in black and white, her carefully built image shattered with a single headline. The revenge had begun in whispers and papers, but now it had a pulse, a rhythm, a public stage. And I, quiet, watchful, steady, sat in the center of it, not as a victim, but as the storyteller of a reckoning that had only just begun. Because the sweetest part was still waiting, and I had all the patience in the world. Patience, you see, is what Ellen never learned. She always wanted everything quick deals, quick praise, quick victories. But revenge, real revenge, is slow, deliberate, and timed so precisely it cannot be undone. Weeks passed after that courtroom hearing, each one drawing the net tighter around her. The notary's journal bore entries altered by another hand. The ink alone told the truth. Different pens, different pressures, all pointing back to Ellen's fraud. When the report came, Thomas delivered it with quiet satisfaction, as though he'd just placed the final piece of a puzzle on the table. You see, Ellen had always prized her reputation even more than her money. She liked to be admired by her friends, by the church, by the community. So I aimed where it hurt her most, her pride. Gloria and Maria helped me host a gathering at the community center under the guise of a heritage night. It was something simple enough. Neighbors bringing old photographs, family stories, recipes. On the surface, harmless nostalgia. But at the center of the room, I placed a framed photo of Henry and me in front of this very house on the day we bought it. 1961. Fresh paint on the siding, my hair done up, Henry grinning with the keys in his hand. Below it, Thomas placed a copy of the deed, the real deed, not Ellen's forgery. It was more than paper, it was proof of history, a reminder that the house wasn't just lumber and shingles, but the root of a family tree. People came with casseroles, pies, and faded Polaroids of their own homes. They gathered around my photo, asking questions, remembering stories about Henry fixing their gutters or me handing out soup during the blizzard of '78. The younger ones saw the contrast between what community meant then and what Ellen had tried to do now. Without me speaking a single cruel word, the truth spread itself. Ellen's name was no longer associated with progress or ambition. It was whispered alongside greed and betrayal. Word travels fastest in small towns, not through newspapers, but through kitchens and pews. By Sunday, I noticed how no one slid down the pew to make room for Ellen when she arrived late to service. Pastor Miller preached that morning about honor thy father and mother, and though he never said her name, every head turned slightly toward her pew. She sat stiff as stone, lips pressed tight, Sophie beside me instead of her. And then came the letter. The developer, desperate to save himself, had cut a deal with the investigators' cooperation in exchange for leniency. His statement named Ellen directly as the instigator, the one who pushed, persuaded, and promised him a share of the house's sale. It was all in writing now, no escaping it. Thomas brought me the letter, and I read it twice before folding it carefully back into the envelope. "This will ruin her," I whispered. Thomas only nodded. "It already has. But ruin is never just about papers. It's about the way people look at you when you walk into the store. It's about the silence where once there was applause." Ellen tried to hold her head high, but the weight of whispers bent her neck lower with each passing day. Even Peter kept his distance now, ashamed of being tied to her schemes. And me? I felt lighter. Each small victory was like taking a stone from the sack I had carried since the day I found out she had betrayed me. My back straightened. My steps grew easier. At night, Sophie and I baked together, her laughter filling the kitchen in a way I thought I'd lost forever. The house, my house, was alive again. Still, I knew the story wasn't finished. Ellen had not yet reached the bottom of the well she had dug. That moment, that final drop, was still coming. And when it did, it would not be me who pushed her. It would be the weight of her own choices pulling her down. I only had to wait. And as I told you, waiting has always been my strength. The final unraveling came faster than I expected. One morning, a heavy knock rattled Ellen's door, 2 county officers with papers in hand. Fraud, falsification, conspiracy. The developer's signed statement had sealed her fate. Neighbors peeked from their curtains as Ellen was led down the steps, still in her silk robe, shouting about misunderstandings. But the robe, the house she had nearly stolen, and the life she had tried to reinvent, all of it, looked pitiful in that moment, like a costume on a stage no one clapped for anymore. I did not attend the arraignment. But word travels. Ellen was indicted formally, her name printed in the county records for all to see. The church ladies clucked their tongues, and the pastor prayed publicly for those who have lost their way through dishonor. She had wanted the whole town to admire her. Instead, she had given them a scandal. But here is where revenge turned into poetry. Ellen had pushed me toward loneliness, toward loss of dignity. Now she found herself in that very place. Peter moved out entirely, ashamed to be dragged down by her. Sophie stayed with me, visiting her mother only once in a while, and always leaving more upset than when she'd arrived. Friends stopped calling. Even the developer, who had once been her accomplice, testified against her with smooth contempt, casting her as the mastermind so he might walk free. The irony was so sharp it almost cut. Ellen, who had tried to sell away her mother's roof for money and prestige, now had neither. She rented a dingy apartment above a laundromat, the smell of detergent clinging to her clothes, the constant rattle of machines her nightly lullaby. I heard it from Sophie, who visited once to drop off groceries. "She looks smaller, Grandma," Sophie said softly, like the air's gone out of her. Meanwhile, my house was mine again, legally, publicly, permanently. Thomas brought me the certified ruling one crisp autumn afternoon. I stood on the porch, the leaves crackling underfoot, and kissed the paper before pressing it to my chest. "Welcome home, Henry," I whispered to the walls around me. For the house had always been more than wood and nails. It was the vessel of a life shared, and now it was safe again. Yet the sweetest justice wasn't the paper or the walls. It was Sophie's laughter at the dinner table, Her quiet apologies whispered one night as she helped wash dishes. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks, for letting her hurt you." I pulled her close, kissed her forehead, and told her what was true, that forgiveness runs thicker than betrayal when love is real. And our love was real. Ellen's pride, though pride had no balm. She could not bear the sideways looks, the empty calendar, the cold pews. The woman who once needed an audience now had none. Her fall was not loud but hollow, a silence she could not escape. And in that silence, my revenge found its final shape, not in her ruin alone, but in my restoration. For I was not broken anymore. I was whole, surrounded by those who mattered, upheld by the truth, and steadied by patience. Ellen had wanted to erase me from the house, from memory, from worth. Instead, she had erased herself. And yet, there was one last chapter left to write, one last turn of irony still waiting in the wings. Because life, in its way, likes to twist the knife just when the curtain seems ready to fall. And when that last twist came, it was not with anger. It was with a kind of poetry that no hand but fate's could have written. It was Christmas Eve, nearly a year since Ellen had tried to sell my house out from under me. Snow dusted the street, lights twinkled from porches, and Gloria's grandchildren sang carols out of tune as they went door to door. Inside my home, the fire glowed, the tree shimmered, and Sophie helped me lay out cookies the way she once did as a little girl. Too many sprinkles on one, none on another, a pattern that made us both laugh. That evening, as neighbors drifted in to share food and cheer, a timid knock sounded at the door. Not the loud rap of an officer, not the casual tap of a friend, a hesitant knock, as if the one on the other side already feared rejection. It was Ellen. She stood on the porch, wrapped in a thin coat, cheeks pale, eyes hollow. Behind her, the snow fell in soft silence, but she looked like a woman who had been walking in a storm all alone. She glanced past me at the warmth inside, at the laughter, at Sophie bent over arranging cookies. For a moment, she opened her mouth as if to ask for something, but no words came. Instead, she handed me an envelope. Her hand shook so badly I thought she might drop it. Then, without waiting for me to open it, she turned and walked away into the night. Inside the envelope was a check, not for money, but a final note from her lawyer. She had signed over any remaining claim to the house, any dispute, any whisper of a fight. Legally and spiritually, the house was mine alone now. The woman who once schemed to erase me had erased herself completely. And the irony, my dears, the deep, aching irony, was that Ellen had wanted this house because she believed it gave her power. Yet here she was, powerless, adrift, while I stood in its doorway, surrounded by love. I did not hate her as I watched her figure vanish down the snowy street. I pitied her. She had chosen greed over grace, pride over family, and it had left her with nothing but empty hands. Sophie slipped her arm around my waist. "Do you want me to go after her?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "No, child. Some journeys are meant to be walked alone." That night, we sang carols by the fire, neighbors filling the room with warmth. Laughter bounced against the old walls, and I felt Henry's presence like a blessing in the glow. The house was alive again, not because it had been saved, but because it was filled with love once more. So here I sit, an old woman with silver hair and tired bones, but a heart at peace. Betrayal may have broken me for a season, but patience, truth, and love stitched me whole again. Ellen's downfall was not my triumph. My triumph was in standing tall when she tried to bury me. And in the end, life itself gave me the sweetest justice, my home, my dignity, my granddaughter's love restored. If you remember nothing else from my story, remember this: revenge is not about cruelty. It is about balance. It is about letting the weight of truth settle where it belongs. And sometimes that truth does the work for you. As for me, I will spend the rest of my days in this house, tending my roses, baking too many cookies, and watching Sophie grow into a woman who knows the worth of honesty. And when the fire crackles on winter nights, I will smile knowing that the story ended not in ruin, but in peace. My home, my justice.